it's funny how often in different books that I currently read that are sort of diagnosing different problems in the modern world, or pointing to signs of collapse as you do, and how many of them start with Bretton Woods, or how many of them Bretton Woods forms this jumping off point for neoliberalism, for all of the institutions that you pointed out there, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, many of them. And I find it, I've always wondered, is Bretton Woods, is that where all of our problems in this modern world began? Do you think that the Western Empire would be on the same trajectory had it not been for Bretton Woods? Is it the thing that made it great, for lack of a better word, and then has also sown the seeds of its own destruction?
No, I don't think so. I actually think that that whole model of what has been called liberal imperialism, excuse me, which emerged at the Bretton Woods Conference and was articulated by the lead American negotiator, Harry Dexter White, was, if you look at the empires of history, it would rank among one of the more enlightened models that we've seen, if not the most enlightened. I'm not making a pitch for empire, but I'm just saying empires are a fact of life. And this was, as things go, this is, if you have to live in an empire, this is one you'd want to live in sooner than you want to live in some of the other ones. I think the problems really began later in the century because there was a time limit to this, as we depict in the book. What happens in that, what's often called the Golden Age in France, les Trente Glorieuses, in Germany it was the Miracle, it was this period from about 1948 till about 1973. The end date changes slightly from Western country to Western country, but during this period in which the economic growth of Western countries is averaging 4 to 6% a year, it's a remarkable expansion, and it's much faster than almost all the developing world. And so there's a pulling away, a widening of the gap from between core and periphery. And essentially what you have is a global trading and also financial regime which acts to effectively transfer resources from periphery to core throughout that period. So some of that added growth is an actual subsidy that's coming from the empire. But nevertheless, throughout this period, there's a couple of things which are happening in the periphery. One is they are developing. They're developing more slowly, but they are growing. The businesses are developing. But the other thing, very importantly, is that if you look at the independence movement in a lot of these countries, the first couple of decades, they're just they're building states from scratch in some cases. There's no bureaucracy to speak of. They don't have central banks. They don't have people with the institutional memory. And they get a lot of things wrong, but they do get some things right. But what they do is a lot of learning, so that by the time you get to late in the century, they're now able to approach international negotiations with a bit more savvy. Until then, they're basically everything. They're just signing up. And, the real turning point comes in Seattle in 1999 when they finally sort of draw a line under the previous negotiating strategy at GATT and WTO meetings, where a handful of Western countries basically set the agenda and then give it to everyone for approval. And there are reasons why in the earlier decades it was convenient for developing countries, almost without exception, to just sign up and approve. They weren't in a position to negotiate better deals, but they did acquire that ability later in the century. So when this model enters into crisis, and it really enters into crisis from the late 1970s, I think with different leadership in Western countries, we might have ended up in a different space. But we ended up with presidents in the U.S. like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, who attempted, and for a short period of time, managed to engineer, in a period that American hegemony, particularly over financial institutions, was quite strong, to engineer a sort of transition which prolongs the benefits to the West, but in the process, I think, sows the seeds, particularly with this model of neoliberal globalization, which gives a short burst of prosperity to Western countries, but ultimately sows the seeds of the popular rebellion against it. I think that's where the problems really begin, that at a critical moment in the history of the West, the leaders we had took us down a bad path. And they did it for reasons that served their constituents well and served their own interests well. But I think was an entirely wrong vision of the way the world could go. And it was a missed opportunity, because I think with the 1990s initially was a period of tremendous optimism and tremendous possibility. And I think it was squandered. I think that's really I think is a crucible of what we're dealing with now. And I don't think it gets enough attention.
It's interesting. You talk about going back to the 1970s. I'm reading a book at the minute, I've basically finished it, but it's called Smart Money. It's by Brunello Rosa and Casey Larson. Actually, if you're listening to this, the last episode of the podcast will be with Brunello Rosa, so check it out. But they speak about the decisions that Nixon made that were forced upon him by the problems of the gold standard and a lot of like international exchange rates and the trade deficit and all things that are like a tiny bit over my head. But then they speak about the fact that period of growth was essentially caused by the amount of volatility in the rest of the world, causing all the money to be saved in America, essentially, from, the Asia was going through their own crises. There was the breakup of the Soviet Union that was causing a lot of there was a lot of geopolitical and global economic turmoil, and all the money was parked in America basically because it was the safest place to keep your money, essentially. And I wonder now if we're seeing the final sort of stage of the money that was then pulled out and sort of slowly put back into each individual economy, building up the peripheries enough to make them the challengers. Like, do you think that's what we're seeing? Is that inflow that went into the 90s and up into the 90s of money into America now parking itself elsewhere and sort of coming to fruition?
I would say it's looking. I think this is one of those moments where, the often misquoted Gramsci line, the old has died, the new isn't able to be born. I think it does apply. I think we're going through a transition, but it's not clear what we're going to, and that's creating some of the volatility. Part of the problem if you look at reserve currencies, the dollar remains by far the dominant currency in international trade. And there's no obvious successor. The only economy that could come close in terms of size and depth, you need to have deep and liquid markets, is China. But the problem is China is still fairly closed in its capital account. And so foreign investors and foreign central banks aren't really comfortable leaving all their money in China. But beyond that, there's an interesting kind of equilibrium which is being disrupted at the moment between the fact that the United States runs this massive trade deficit and it is the holder of the reserve currency, that because so many countries have a balance of payment surplus, so they have a surplus of dollars at the end of the year trading with America. What do they do with them? They have to park them into, which they're generally happy to do, because it's very easy to move your money in and out of, or has been very easy to move your money in and out of America. There's lots of investment opportunities. Treasuries are a relatively safe investment because they're safe because they're safe. It's one of these paradoxes, if you will, or these tautologies. Because the United States because people are quite happy to accept payment in US dollars, the United States can print US dollars. And because there is that sort of agreement, in a sense, the sky's the limit. And so there's no chance of them ever not being able to pay their bills. However, I think one of the interesting things, and I wrote about this for Unheard last year, was if you look at the price of gold, it is setting a warning. Gold is just going up and up and up with no end in sight. And that is driven, from what we can tell, largely by central banks looking to diversify out of the dollar. It's an easy thing to do, to go from dollars to gold and then to hold them in gold as a sort of halfway station to another solution. We're not going to see a return to gold because, for a variety of reasons, gold is not particularly useful as a reserve currency, as not as a trade currency. It's useful as a reserve, but not as a trade currency. Some argue that we're going to see this with cryptocurrency, with Bitcoin. I'm less persuaded of that, and that, its surge also reflects a search for alternatives. And as for the U.S. share, I mean, if Trump were to succeed in reducing America's trade deficit with the world, that would mean that other countries would have fewer dollars left over. So they'd have to park them elsewhere. And if they start trading more among themselves, one can see a situation where you get this pluralization, fragmentation. And they are clearly experimenting with new forms of international payment settlement. It's only a small share of the total market. Still nearly 90% of international transactions are conducted in dollars, simply because all governments will accept dollars. Therefore, if you have a trade between Suriname and Outer Mongolia, they convert them both into dollars for the purpose of their transaction, because neither has particular reason to hold the currency of the other country, but they can always take the dollar anywhere. But they are looking in bilateral trade. There are growing experiments, partly to get away from the dollar, and also because of growing concern about the fact that U.S. governments have taken to using the dollar as a sort of as a cudgel with which to beat the people it doesn't like, sort of seizing the bank accounts of governments once a sanction. And this is causing growing anxiety. So I think we're in a transition period, but it's one which could easily last 20 years. For the foreseeable future, I don't see any currency challenge of the dollar and the BRICS currency. The idea of a BRICS currency is a non-starter. But I do think the idea of diversification, and as a reserve asset, only now just over half of global reserves are held in US dollars. The rest is held in a bunch of other currencies and gold. And most of the diversification has been into governments that are, we would say, allies of the US. So it's Canada, it's Europe, it's the euro, it's the pound, it's the Swiss franc. But now, of course, we're moving into a world where we can't assume that they're going to remain allies. And other countries might say, well, look, I'd be happy to park more money in Canadian dollars. I actually think it's a more stable country than the US. We're moving into uncharted territory. I mean, that is an overused phrase, but we just don't know what's going to happen. But I think what we can say is that this is not going to end well for America. I think it may well end well for China.
Good news, everyone. My book about GameStop, the craziest story ever told, is now finished. Well, almost. Still waiting for the final draft. So, in the meantime, I think you should look at pre-ordering it or any one of the multiple fantastic, beautiful t-shirts that I have designed in order to sell with the book. Thank you, everyone, for your patience over the last few years while I have been finishing it very slowly. And I am really, really excited for people to read it. Link is in the description below. Enjoy the podcast.